Hello everyone. We're now starting to get into the meat of the post-flop section of the course, and the first video is going to be about flop donking. So when someone has opened, you're in the big blind and the flops come, and should you donk? And to be honest, this is not the most important of spots. It's quite rare that you want to do it. It's not going to be huge EV to either donk sometimes or not donk sometimes. But while it might not be worth your time to sort of spend a load of time running tons of simulations and learning different strategies on different boards and so on, fortunately I've done that for you. So the end result is actually quite a basic few things that you can do to just add in a bit of extra EV, not just in terms of game theory, like improving your closeness to game theory play, but also it just gives you an extra ability to exploit your opponents. So I think it's going to be worth your time to just watch this video and see what you think. And I expect that quite a lot of you will actually think, hey, that's actually pretty simple. I can implement what he's telling me to do here without too much trouble. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I've introduced the program that we're going to be using before, but because this is the sort of one of the first flop videos where we're really going into a bit of detail, I'm going to try and go through it quite slowly and make sure everything's clear as to what I'm doing in the program. So this is a contest that I've run with the button opening and the big blind calling, and it's just run through a ton of flops basically and played out the hands, and we've now got these results which tell you how it thinks you should play in all the different situations that it's come across. So I filtered for when we're in the big blind and we're on the flop, so whether or not we're going to be donking or not. And you can see that overall it's calling, which is this column here, checking, this column here 97% of the time, and only donking 3% of the time. So the first thought is obviously, as I said earlier, what's the point? Let's just always check and not bother with it. But as we'll see, it might be worthwhile. So the good news is, if you do want to implement a donking strategy on certain flops, is that you can straight away rule out like most flops that you just don't donk on. As you scroll down, you can see there's a ton of hundreds here. You can also sort this so that now it's sorted by which ones it's checking on most, and you can see you scroll a long way down on 100s and then get to some that are pretty much 100, and there's only really a few flops that you're actually donking on. So I can also filter for types of flop here, and the first thing I'm going to show you is here. So we filtered for flops that are 9 high or higher. So we've got, you can see here, 9 high flops, and then scrolling down to 10 high flops, jack high flops, queen high flops, etc. And you can see when we group this set of flops together, we're checking 99% of the time, so pretty much never donking. And if we filter them, if we sort them so that we've got the ones that are checking the least often, so the ones that are donking the most often at the top, you can see we've only got one flop here, which is actually, there's actually a donk percentage of more than 10% on, which is this ace-5-4. So pretty much, for the most part, we can rule out donking on flops that are higher than a 9 high or higher. So anytime the button opens, we call them the big blind, the flop is 9 high or higher, just check, don't need to think about it. The slight exception here, which you might want to ignore or you might want to consider, is the sort of ace-5-4, it's also ace-3 deuce, king-5-4, and some of these paired boards where the pair is like mid or lowish, so 7-7 here, where we just through how the preflop ranges are, and these are the preflop ranges that I've shown you on Monka Solver in the preflop section, we've probably just got a little bit more 7s in it than the button opener and so on, so it's just donking a little bit there, but you can probably just ignore that because everybody's ranges are not going to be identical, and those sort of effects might not really play out based on your actual range and your opponent's actual range and so on. The ace-5-4 and ace-3 deuce, it's because we in the big blind are flatting, say, deuce-3 suited and all of 5-4 off, whereas the button is not opening 5-4 offsuit or 3 deuce suited, and we just end up with a little bit of an advantage at the top of the ranges. If we open up, hopefully you can see this okay. So this is our range for that we've like flatted pre-flop, and we can see that we've got a straight 0.72% of the time here, and trips 1.1, 2 pair 4%, and you can hover over these to see. So we've hovered over straight, and you can see we've got deuce 3 suited. You can see the combos here. So this is 3 of diamonds, deuce of diamonds. You just kind of, well, it's a grid. I'm sure guys can work it out as long as I go through quite slowly. And then if we look at the buttons opening, the buttons range, the button doesn't have any straights and is about the same trips, and a little bit more trips and about the same 2 pair. So if we just set these up here, so you can see that we're about equal. The 2 players are about equal on this flop in terms of 2 pair plus. We've got 5.8% roughly for the for the big blind, and 5.8 for the button as well. So we're about even at the top end of the ranges, but the big blind's got more equity because we've got 3.8% open enders compared to 0.79% for the button, and also 19% gut shots compared to 7.9% on the button. So we just got this kind of slight advantage in the ranges in terms of the very, very top end having some straights when the button doesn't, and then also just having more equity hands that have straight draws. So that leads us to wanting to bet this small percentage, like 20% donk with a very small size. And similarly with the ace-3 deuce, we're actually using a bigger size on the ace-3 deuce because we've got more of an advantage at the very top, and it's less about just having more equity. So if we look at this one, we can see that, let's move it a bit more for you. So we can see here that we have 2.1% straights, 1.1% trips, 3.2% 2 pair. So we've got sort of 6.4% of our range being 2 pair or better on the ace-3 deuce, and then the button has like 1.5%ish, 1.4% of 2 pair plus. So we've got more of a sizable advantage at the top of the ranges in the big blind on the ace-3 deuce, whereas then as you get down into the 1 pairs, if we hover over 1 pair, you can see obviously we're missing ace-king and ace-queen in the big blind, whereas the button is, has all of ace-king and ace-queen and so on. So quickly the range advantage disappears, and it's really sort of driven by the top end of the range, our donking range here for the big blind. So that's why we have a larger size, but a smaller frequency. So we got a couple of examples there. It's probably gone over that in more detail than needed because you could kind of ignore them. They're kind of a quirk of the ranges in that, if the button did open 6-7 or 5-4 offsuit, then things would change a little bit, and you wouldn't really expect the big blind to be donking at all. It's probably kind of safe to say that won't be the case for most players who are playing well online, at least at a decent level. So you can donk on these boards a little bit if you want, or you can just ignore them and wait for the more clear spots that I'm going to come to in a bit. So let's have a look at a couple of other filters that rule out a few things for us. So these are monotone boards. These are all the monotone boards that came across. You can see here, never donking more than 2%. So let's just rule these out. There's just, the ranges work out such that there's no need to donk on monotone boards. Another one would be trip boards. Only got a couple of examples here, but not really donking on these, 1% on one of them. So let's rule out donking on trip boards. So now let's go to the boards where we are going to want to donk. Oops, I wanted a maximum of 8 high. So 8 high or lower boards. And you can see here that we're now donking 12%, which is still not a huge amount, but starting to become vaguely significant. But this is also including the monotone boards where we're not donking at all. So if we go for, say, So this is non-paired boards with rainbow and maximum 8 high. You can see here now, we've only got a few examples here, but we're basically going up to donking about 20% on average, and quite a lot more than that on some of the boards. And you can kind of see the pattern is that we're donking on the boards where they're connected and there are straights possible, which we're going to have more of just because the big blind calls this much wider range than the button opens. So we're going to have more straights than the button does, more 2 pairs and so on when the boards come out low like this. Whereas when it's sort of 7-3 deuce or 8-7-3 without those straights, and where we're not calling 7 deuce pre-flop at all, for example, then we don't have such a 2-pair advantage as well. Then you don't end up donking. But let's also look at the suited flops just to show that this trend sort of continues. So have maximum 8 high, not paired, and suited. And you can see again that we're not donking on the 8-7-3, 8-6 deuce, 8-4 deuce suited, and so on. And then if we go up to the ones we're donking the most on, it's the 5-4-3, 8-6-5, 6-5 deuce, etc. So yeah, we can start to see the sort of boards that we are donking on. And just finally, let's have a look at paired boards. Paired boards also donking sometimes, particularly when the pairs are lower. So we've got 6 deuce deuce here, 7-5-5, doing so less on the 8-8-3 and 8-6-6. So in summary, we're pretty much ruling out donking on almost all boards, but low, sort of mid to low connected boards, so 8-7-5 type boards or lower, that's when we want to start thinking about having a donking range. So we're going to now examine those boards a little bit and see how to play on them. But before I do that, actually, let's just go to the overall 8 high boards, and we can see that our average size is going to be around about half pot or slightly lower. So we're starting to build this strategy of having no donking range on most boards, but on the low connected boards and low paired boards, we're going to have a strategy of donking, sometimes with a size of half pot or a little bit smaller if you want to. Okay. Before I go on to hand selection for these boards and how we're actually going to play the hands, it's all very well knowing that we need to donk on certain boards, but obviously we need to know how we're actually going to play specific hands that we hold in these situations. Before we do that, I'm going to have a quick look for you at when the other positions have opened, so cut off, hijack, and under the gun. And hopefully that will give you a bit more information on how to play. So we can see again that overall, this is now, the cut-off opening and the big blind flatting. And again, overall, it's just about 3% donk, so similar as before. If we go for 9 high or higher, we can see that we're actually starting to donk sometimes on these 9 high boards. But if we go 10 high or higher, then we're pretty much not. Again, it's just the ace 5-3, that sort of ace 4-3 and so on, and a slight bit on this monotone board, which I'll talk about more because it's more of an effect under the gun. But for the most part, if the boards are 10 high or higher, we're never donking still. And if we go to 9 high or lower, that's when we start to have a donking range. And we're still not donking really on these monotone boards, 4-3 deuce monotones, 6-4-3 monotones, etc. But we are starting to donk on these 7-6-5, 9-6-6, and so on. And something that we're going to notice as we go back through the opening positions is that we're just sort of donking on slightly higher boards. And it's a small effect, but it's just slightly higher than we are when the button is opening, and that's because of the comparative ranges between the button, or between the opener, and the big blind. So when the opener goes back towards under the gun, their range is very much weighted towards the very high hands with much less of the sort of mid cards, compared to when the opener is opening on the button and they have sort of all these sort of high card hands and also mid card hands. And similarly, the big blind is defending tighter when under the gun is opened, so they have less of the very low cards in their range, but more of the mid cards, while the opener is sort of losing those mid cards from their range. So it's just shifting a little bit. And if we go ahead to, this is now the hijack opening, and we can again see minimum 10 high. We're now starting to get just a small bit of donking on hands like on boards like 10-8-7, 10-7-7, 10-9-6, etc. But if you keep in just jack high, then there's very rarely donking. There's no sort of boards where you should be donking more than 10% of the time, jack high or higher. But again, if we go to 10 high or lower, then we are starting to get quite a few boards, the 9-7-5s, 8-6-5, 9-8-5. So you can kind of see that whereas the highest donk frequencies when we're facing a button open are on these 5-4 deuce, 5-4-3, 6-3 deuce, the very, very lowest of the flops. As we get to hijack, now the highest donk frequencies are on these sort of 9-8-5s, 8-6-5s, etc. And finally, we'll have a quick look at under the gun. And we see again, if we have, say, jack high or higher, we are, so we're starting to donk on these ace high monotone flops. I'll talk about that in a sec. But other than that, still not really donking much on jack high or higher, just these paired boards there. But if we go to the 10 high or lower, then again we now have these sort of mid boards, also 5-4-3, just because we're going to have some 7-6 in the range, but mostly these mid boards that we're donking on sometimes. And just to have a look at these monotone boards before we move on, you can see that we're not donking on any of the lower monotone boards, or any of them at all really, but we are on ace high monotone boards. And the reason for that is just that the under the gun opening range, if we take a look at that, so much of its suited range is ace-x suited. So if we go to the flop and we get our range in the big blind up here compared to the under the guns range on the flop, maybe you can see these both here, you can see that our range, we have 8.9% flushes compared to just 5.1% flushes for the button. So we're just starting to get this advantage at the top of the ranges on ace high monotone boards when the when under the gun is open and we flat it in the big blind, so we can start donking a little bit there. But I'm going into this in a bit more detail than necessary maybe, but we will sort of boil this down and learn just a basic set of rules by the end of it. But just sort of giving those of you who want to be even more advanced an idea of, as you go back through the opening ranges, the slight changes, subtle sort of changes that come about in terms of which flops you should be donking and so on. So let's go to hand selection, because as I said, it's all very well knowing how to play overall, but you need to know how to play the actual hand you've got. So overall, our aim with donking is to create a donking range that's stronger than our checking range. And we're doing that because we're in this scenario where our range in the big blind is quite a bit stronger than usual compared to the opener's ranges, which is normally the stronger range. So we're not going to face as high a c-bet frequency as we normally do because our range is stronger. And that makes our stronger hands less, like lower EV of checking than they normally are, because we're not going to get as much money in the pot with them because the imposition player is checking them back. So what we're doing is we're constructing a range whereby we can get more money in with our strong hands by having this betting range which weakens our checking range. So by having a betting range which is stronger than the checking range, then our checking range is weakened, and the in-position player can therefore c-bet more often than they could if we were never donking. And then the EV of our stronger hands goes up, obviously. And we reach this equilibrium where the EV is the same, because we're going to be playing mixed strategy, so the EV is the same of donking and of checking with our strong hands and with all our other hands. But it's important to kind of have this idea in your head of what's going on here, and it's that we are, the in-position player, if we never donk, is c-betting too rarely compared to normal, which isn't good for our strong hands. So we're then starting to donk some strong hands, because the way that the in-position player should react to our donk gives us more money for our strong hands than it does if we check. But of course, if we just donked our strong hands, then the in-position player would play very tight versus us and it wouldn't work. So we build this range around it, and as I say, the equilibrium comes in when we've donked a stronger range than we're checking, but not sort of way stronger or anything. We need to rein it in a bit, because if we just donked a really strong range and checked a really weak range, then obviously the in-position player would then c-bet a load versus our checks and play very tight versus our bets, and then it would be higher EV to play our strong hands by checking. Okay, so let's have a look at an example to see this. So here we have a pretty typical board that we might want to donk on. We're donking about 27% of the time, and we're doing it with a size of about half pot. So let's have a look at some ranges here. And see how we're playing. So if we examine, you can see here by each individual hand type. So we've got straight here, and this little thing on the left corresponds with this thing at the bottom. And this is telling us that we are donking 42% of the time with our straights. And you can see that's quite a bit higher than the 27% that our overall range is donking. And the same with trips. Go down to the bottom again, you can say 46% of the time we're betting with our trips and 51% with our two pair. So this is just confirming what I said, that we're betting our strong hands more than sort of our average betting percentage, and we're going to be betting our weak hands less, as you're going to see. And then as you go into one pair, you can see this is down to 37%, which is getting closer to the overall percentage, and then high cards overall are betting 22%, which is lower than the overall percentage. So in terms of sort of high, mid, low, I think the way we want to think about this is that we have overall our betting range is going to be so if we take these group of flops that we're betting as a whole, and because we want to create a basic strategy, we don't want to be trying to think, should I be donking 20% of the time on 6-3 deuce versus 25% on 6-4 deuce or whatever. We just want to have this sort of rough idea of we're betting the low frequency or a little bit higher, maybe 20-25%, when we have a board that we want to donk on. And then with our strong hands, we want to move that up to a medium frequency or a little bit below. So we're looking at donking when we have a strong hand at about 50% of the time or a bit less. And then we're going to look at how to play with other types of hands. So when we go to our air hands, we can see the hands that like betting the most. So they're the strongest yellow combos here. We can see their backdoor flush draw hands. So we've got 10-7 suited with a backdoor flush draw is pretty much always donking, and 9-7 suited and 9-8 suited, Queen 9 suited, Queen 8 suited, King 8 suited, etc. And what's going on here is these are the hands which are sort of hating life the most if we check and face a bet. So they're not the hands that are hating life as in they have to fold, but they're the hands that are hating life as in they've got 2 overcards and a backdoor flush draw. And if you see, we can play through the hand a little bit here. If you see, if we check and the opponent bets, these sort of hands are playing mixed strategies. So King 8 suited here is usually almost always calling, but it's folding 6.6% of the time. And Queen 9 suited, again, it's folding 35% of the time. versus a bet, and so on. So these sort of hands that, they don't have a lot of EV in check calling at all, but they therefore make pretty good donk bluff hands, if you like. And we can see it's fairly yellow with a lot of 7x, because that's kind of 2 overcards with a backdoor straight draw, if you like. Any 5 or 4 on the turn will just give us that extra, as well as having overcards. We're also going to have a straight draw on the turn, on those turns. And then also just our gut shots in general, our 5x and 4x are betting somewhat frequently. So if we summarize so far, we've got our very strong hands betting up to about a mid frequency, and that goes down as you go through into weaker pairs towards betting low frequency with many of your weaker pairs. And then as bluffs, we're betting always or very high frequencies with sort of overcard and so weakish overcard backdoor flush draw hands. So you can see we're always checking with, say, King Jack, which is a higher backdoor flush draw, but these Queen 9, Queen 8, 10, 7, etc. They're the ones we want to be betting like almost always. And then we want to be also betting a mid frequency with our like 7x, 9, 7, etc. and our gut shots, so King 5 and Queen 5 and so on. You can see it's all round about 50% betting, and obviously we're not going to learn all these slight variations which will quite possibly change as you change the accuracy and so on anyway, but we just want a rough idea of what sort of frequencies to play. And you can see we're always checking with our, what in this case is kind of our worst air, which is the stuff that would definitely check fold versus a bet. So the King 10, King 9, all these sort of overcard hands that have no real potential for having backdoor flush draws, backdoor straight draws. They're just 2 overcards, which is about as weak as it gets. And you can see again, if we go to what we're playing versus a bet, we're folding all these hands without the backdoor flush draws, the King 10s and so on, King Jacks, Queen Jack and so on. So that's about it really for the hand selection, the way we want to play this. So I hope you can see. It's kind of difficult when I'm rambling away to really define this clearly, but the way we want to think about it is we get ourselves on a flop which is one of our flops that we're going to be donking on, and we say, okay, I think we're going to be donking low frequency, a little bit higher maybe on this flop, and the way we're going to execute that is when we've got a strong hand, we're going to bet about half the time. When we've got a really good hand to bluff, so the backdoor flush draws and 2 overcard type hands, then we're going to just bet almost always, or always if you want, it won't really matter. When we've got some sort of gut shot or backdoor straight draw, like the 7x on the 6-3 deuce, then we're going to bet about half the time again, and then we're just going to always check if we've got some junky overcard type hands that don't have anything else going for them. So it's kind of a fairly straightforward strategy, and I'm just going to show a couple of other boards just to demonstrate that this does sort of carry across in terms of how we play. So again, we've got 5-4 deuce here, and you can see again that we're betting the most with these Queen 8 of diamonds, Queen 9 of clubs, etc. Basically anything. And we've got 2 donk sizes here, but obviously we're not going to try and actually implement anything like that. The way the program is set up is that it can use a maximum of 2 sizes. So I imagine the EV here of using, say, 1 size of half pot and using these 2 sizes, which are 1 smaller and 1 larger than half pot, are almost the same, but it's gone for this strategy this time just because it can. But we don't want to try and implement that, obviously. But yeah, I just want to show you that it's the same thing. We've got these 7x and 6x, which 7x is kind of the back door, and also betting some ace-x here because that's now a gut shot, and 6x as well, obviously being gut shot, and 3x is betting a lot. And still we're always checking pretty much with these overcard hands which don't have much going for them, like the King 10, etc. But this is a board where, just because of how the ranges are exactly, it's actually donking half the time here rather than the 20-25% of the time that we're going to be donking. And you can try and implement something like this, but it's not really going to add a huge amount to your EV to try and really work out exactly what flops you want to donk what percentages on. So I would go with just going 20-25%. And this is the reason you see so much more yellow here, is just because it's betting more often on this flop. But if we were to take it back to our actual percentages that we're going to be betting, then it would be very similar to the sort of percentage we were talking about of betting half the time with these 6x type hands, etc. And another one I was going to quickly look at was 5-4-3. Just this one's suited, which changes things ever so slightly, but you'll be able to see that the principles are very much the same. So you can now see that this sort of crisscross pattern, these are the hands with a spade, which are the backdoor flush draws, and those are the hands that are betting a lot. So here, for example, here we've got Queen of Diamonds, 8 of Spades. So we've got the spade there, and this is always betting. And again, it's very, very similar, apart from that, checking all the King 10, King Jack, etc., with nothing going for it. And finally, I was going to look at 8-6-5, which is similar again. Again, you can see we've got this kind of crisscross pattern where we're betting the backdoor flush draws and not betting at all with the King Jack, King 10, nothing going for it type hands. And the reason I knew there was a reason I put this flop in. It was just to say that when we've got a flop like this, also hands like Ace Deuce with nothing going for it, and King Deuce with out backdoor flush draw, etc. These are just check folds. We also, these become sort of the worst hands other than the King Jack, King 10. These are definitely not going to be donking at all. Okay, so we've got our strategy kind of sorted out there. Hopefully that's clear. I'll probably summarize it one more time at the end, just because it's hard to tell when I'm talking whether I'm rambling too much or whether it's actually as clear as it should be. But now we need to talk about exploitation a little bit. So while we're not going to add a ton of EV with donking from a game theory perspective, because as you've seen, it's quite rare that any particular hand is betting 100%. It's donking 100%. There's sort of a few hands in each of these boards which are donking almost always or always. But as we've heard in previous videos, if our opponent is playing GTO, then anytime we have a mixed strategy, we can't, we can pick 0% with that hand, 100% with that hand, 50% with that hand, any percentages in between, and it doesn't change our EV if our opponent is playing GTO. So when we have this hand that we're supposed to donk 95%, we can just never donk that hand without losing an EV if our opponent's playing GTO. So that's why people kind of think, oh, there's not really any point in having donking strategy, because our hands, no hands really love donking for the most part. But what can cost us EV is if people are exploiting our frequencies, our overall frequencies. So a lot of people do this sort of implicitly by when they do their solver runs and they're trying to work out how to play on certain boards, they'll just not allow the big blind to donk because people don't do it. So by doing that, they will then get a strategy for c-betting which exploits the fact that their opponent is not donking if the opponent is indeed not donking. However, if you are donking, the strategy they've calculated for their c-betting strategy, so their standard c-betting strategy that they're going to be trying to implement, is going to be incorrect versus you. And you're going to be playing, if you play your GTO strategy, they're changing from their GTO strategy to assume that you never donk, but you are donking. So that's not good for them. And particularly if you know how their strategy is likely to have changed because of the fact that because they think you're not donking, or because the way they've calculated everything assumes their opponent's not donking, then you can exploit that a little bit. So the way that would work in that instance would be that your opponent's, their c-bet frequency would be too low because they're assuming that your range is stronger than it is, because they're assuming you've not donked a stronger range than you're checking. So maybe they will be, they'll be donking, c-betting, 10% too rarely, and therefore you can you should be donking more, particularly with your stronger hands, because your stronger hands are not getting as much EV as they should when they check, because your opponent isn't betting often enough. So yeah, you can donk an even stronger range, and as long as your opponent isn't playing too tight versus your donks, then you get more EV from donking your strong hands than checking them. So you can kind of exploit that. And there's kind of 4 things to think about when you're exploiting here, 4 different ways that things can go. So if your opponents are c-betting too rarely, as in that example, then you want to donk more. If your opponents are c-betting too frequently, so this might be the case if your opponent isn't really very board aware, so they just have quite a high overall c-bet frequency, and they just don't really think about, oh, well, this is a good board for me to c-bet, this is a bad board for me to c-bet. I'm sure these players exist all over the place, particularly if you play live or lower stakes. Then you're going to find all sorts of players that, you know, they might be still c-betting 70% on sort of a 6-5-4 board or something. And if you're playing as someone like that, then you want to never donk, but you want to make sure that you're check raising a lot more than normal, because you've got to take advantage of their sort of bad c-betting frequencies. And then the other things you've got to think about is how your opponents play versus donks. And this won't be something that you can know to start with, because people just don't donk. So how are you going to know how they play versus donks? But if they play too tight versus donks, then we should obviously donk weak hands more. If they play too loose versus donks, we should donk strong hands more. Kind of obvious and goes without saying. But for the most part, when you start off doing this, you're going to be thinking about just their c-bet frequencies, and you kind of start this base strategy of donking a low frequency on these particular boards, but then you adjust it if they c-bet too rarely or too often. As you do it more, you might start to pick up sort of how people tend to react to your donks. Maybe people raise too often, maybe they fold too often, call too often, whatever it is, and then you can take that into consideration as well and start to, and it'll be something that you're familiar and comfortable with because you're paying attention to it. And obviously I'm not saying to do this instead of more important things, but when you've got the important things sorted and you've just kind of been playing this base strategy for donking for quite a while, and you're starting to notice things and pick up on how people tend to react, then you can start exploiting in that respect as well. And other people won't be as used to playing against it as you. And people might react really quite differently. Like some people might not really raise very often at all versus your half pot donks, or they might just be kind of scared of them in a way and only raise with a very strong range. And other people might kind of treat it almost as if you've checked, just like, who's this idiot donking me, I'm just going to raise 50% of the time. So yeah, just work out how people play versus you and adjust accordingly. In order to get how to exploit though, we also have to know how our opponent should play versus donks. So I'm going to have a quick look at that. So we're going to have button opening, small blind folds, call, and now bet. So we can see that we'll keep it with the 8 high actually, just because these are the sort of boards that we're talking about. Oops, I say that and then I go ahead and remove the filter. So yeah, we can see that it should be folding 28%, and bear in mind as well, this is versus different sizes. So we've got these 3 here are versus a third pot donk, and these lot here are versus a half pot donk, and these are versus 2/3 pot donk roughly. So we can see that overall we've got this fold of 28% and a call of 60%, and then a raise of 12%, with the most common raise size by a lot being around about half pot. So if we face a donk ourselves, we want to think, okay, we want to raise frequency, and it's on one of these boards, I should say. If it's on some board where they should never be donking, then obviously you want to raise quite a bit more often. But on these boards where people should be donking, when you face a donk, think of an overall frequency of around about 10 to 12% for raising, and just use about half pot. And this is how your opponent should be playing. So if you use the formula for minimum defense frequencies, then versus a third pot bet, you would expect that people should be folding about 25% of the time. And I kind of use this minimum defense frequency formula as sort of a guide, because as we know, and as we'll see from all sorts of different videos, it's not really how it works. You don't just fold according to this formula, but it's kind of good to know whether the way I think of it is whether you should be overfolding or you should be underfolding compared to the formula. And here the imposition player should be underfolding compared to the formula. And versus half pot, then you would think people, according to the formula, would fold 33% of the time, but actually they're folding less than 33% of the time in all these cases. And it's just because, that's the way it works. Your betting range, despite being stronger than your checking range, is not hugely strong. It's not sort of the case that the imposition player has a ton of hands with just totally no equity at all, because their worst hands tend to have at least one overcard and usually two. So you don't just have this sort of section of the range like you do in some spots where the player facing a bet just is kind of auto folding just a chunk of their range because it's got terrible equity versus your betting range. So yeah, and in position and so on, people should be under folding a little bit versus your donks. And yeah, raising this frequency of about 12% ish. So when you start to build up a little bit of a sample of how people play against you, you can kind of see whether this is how people are actually playing. And let's look briefly, although it's raising a little bit more than the 12% on this particular example, but because we were looking at this flop before, let's do it here. So you can see the sort of orangey yellow are the hands that it likes raising versus the donk. So it particularly likes ace-6 with the backdoor flush draw, and then just normal ace-6 and king-6 and so on. It's raising a lot with 7s and a lowish amount with 8s and 9s and 10s and so on. So it's definitely not just raising any overpair, any decent top pair, and even with hands like 6s, it's actually flatting a lot, and 3s is flatting sometimes. 5-4 suited is raising pretty much always. And you can see here as well, if you look at the way it's playing straights, it's basically always raising, whereas trips it's flatting sometimes and so on. But I guess what I'm getting at here is if you think your opponent is always going to be raising you with pretty much any strong hand, and their frequencies were still, say, around 12%, then you would know that their range is too polarized, or their range is too strong, and you can play accordingly versus their raises. So yeah, I think that's about it. Yeah, I just wanted to give you an idea of several things in this video. First of all, on how many flops you can just totally ignore the possibility of donking without it really costing you anything. There's spots where you should be donking technically like 5%, but you can just ignore that. And then I wanted to give you this sort of subsection of boards, which are these mid to low connected boards. So there's a straight possibility of there being a straight there, and you're going to have straights in two pairs that the opening player does not have. And on those boards, you want to be donking a lowish frequency, maybe low to a little bit more than low. And the way that you execute that is by betting about half the time with your very strong hands and decreasing that frequency as your hands get weaker. And then with air hands, you're going to be also betting about half the time with backdoor straight draws and gutters, and then you're going to be betting always with hands like 2 overcards and a backdoor flush draw, and then you're always going to be checking with just random 2 overcard hands or 1 overcard hands that don't have some sort of draw with them. So yeah, and then remember as we go back through the opening positions, the sort of board you're donking on is just going up just a little bit, and then remember to exploit. And at the start, you're going to be exploiting mostly based on people's c-bet frequencies, but then eventually, hopefully, you can start to exploit a little bit based on their donking frequencies, and hopefully you'll have an advantage in this game because the other person doesn't really know how to react to donks. It's not something they've looked at, because any solver runs they've done, they've maybe even just cut out donks as an option. So I've ended up talking for quite a long time on this topic, which is not the most important ever, but I hope, while it's taken my time to do this and look into it, I hope that you can take from it quite a simple, basic strategy that you can implement straight away without really much thinking, and that this will be able to just increase your EV in a little bit, just give you a little bit of an extra edge against people who are not doing it, which is a lot of what poker becomes about when you get to a higher level, is just taking advantage of all these small edges which your opponents aren't doing. So our next video is going to, or next set of videos I guess, are going to be about flop C betting, and I hope you'll all join me for that. Thank you.